Hey everyone, good morning. I'm assuming it's morning where you are. It could be afternoon or evening as well. But very warm welcome to the Wolf Summit main stage. My name is Robin Wouters from Tech.eu, and I'm here to do a presentation on CEE-based innovation and scale-ups, which I'm really, really happy about because for the last 15 years, I've been writing about technology, specifically in Europe. And for a long time, I've been saying that the CEE region is ripe for innovation and ripe for disruption, and that a lot of great companies will be coming from there. So I'm very pleased to welcome you here for the presentation that I'm about to do. We are calling it Scaling Up in the CE region. We're going to combine some data with insights that we've gained from years of collecting data on the European tech ecosystem. First, a little bit something about TechEU itself. We are a media/market intelligence company, so we want to be the source of European technology news, data, and market intelligence for the rest of the world, and be a one-stop shop. I'm not going to dwell on this too long to get to the good part, so don't worry. But very roughly, this is what we offer. We're not just a media company, but we also offer market intelligence. We do advertising campaigns with clients. We help curate events, which we're also doing for the Wolf Summit later today. And we also get involved in EU projects sometimes. So that's just a brief intro about TechEU. Let's get to the good part, which is the presentation, of course. The research that we did was on scale-ups in the CEE region. And whenever you do research like that, it's very important to define both of these things at the same time. What is a scale-up, and what do you actually consider to be part of the CEE region? So to answer the second question, when we look at the CEE region, which is, it has multiple definitions from different angles, but we take a very broad view on what Central Eastern European countries actually mean, what they're comprised of. So we went very broad in terms of geography. Just so you know, when we look at scale-ups, this is also a definition that's different depending on who you ask. But for us, when we looked at the data, we made a distinction between companies that have raised more than 15 million euros in their lifetime compared to those who have not, or at least not yet. So that's sort of the cutoff point that we used, 15 million euros, CE region, and that's the basis of the research that I'm presenting today. So first of all, there are a number of notable scale-ups in CEE. Considering the topic of this conference and the audience, I'm sure you will recognize a lot of these names. But just so you know, they are coming from all over the place, whether it's Slovakia or Czech Republic, Estonia, of course, and Poland. There are a number of really category-leading companies coming from all over the region, which is very, very great to see. So in the research, bear in mind, $15 million or plus 50 million euros raised or more, in the CE region. We've counted about 84 companies that fit those criteria. Interestingly enough, Estonia doesn't come out on top in terms of the number of companies, at least. That is actually Poland. But of course, Estonia always scores very high on these charts as well. Interestingly, Czech Republic, another Baltic country, Lithuania, and Ukraine rounding out the top 5. From those 84 scale-ups, we know that they have raised 13 billion euros since we started doing the research, which is roughly 2014, 2015. So if you go back even further, then of course the number will be higher. But based on the data that we have collected over the last few years, we know that CEE scale-ups have raised more than 13 billion euros so far. Just to put that in perspective, though, we have about 43 billion euros going to European tech startups in 2020 alone. So last year, roughly 3 times as much funding went to European startups and scale-ups in general. So these are, interestingly, 8 billion of that 13 billion euros have actually been raised by only 5 companies. I'm sure the names will also be very recognizable to you. In Poland, we had InPost and Allegro. Both of them IPO'd and raised quite substantial amounts in those stock exchange entries when they did their flotations, one in 2021, so very recently, and one last year. But those are the number 2 scale-ups in terms of funding raised, even though it was through an IPO. And then we have, of course, the Romanian unicorn UiPath. We have TransferWise, now called Wise, from Estonia, and 4Finance from Latvia. So interestingly, also from 4 different countries. So when you look at the scale-up funding per country, you can see that Poland also comes out on top because of the aforementioned reasons, because of those two companies, Allegro and InPost, really raising record amounts in their IPOs. Roughly 6.4 billion euros went to Polish companies, compared to 1.9 for Estonia and 1.8 for Romania, so roughly on par, but mostly thanks to UiPath and TransferWise, of course. But those are the companies, those are the countries in the top three, rounded out by the Czech Republic, helped by Rolik, of course, and Latvia as the fifth. Keep in mind, this is only the scale-ups that were the 84 companies that I mentioned in the beginning. So when you look at the number of rounds of more than 15 million euros in the CEE region, and you look at the number of rounds tracked from 2018 to 2020, you can see that there is a nice going up and to the right from 6 to 10 to 14. However, interestingly, this year seems to be a really breakout year, so we're expecting quite record numbers for scale-up funding in the CEE. And this is also already being reflected in the numbers for the first quarter. So you can see that the first quarter of this year, bear in mind that this quarter is not even over yet, so we're not there yet. But you can already see that the number of 15 million plus euro rounds is already on par with the total in 2019. So you can see that there's really an acceleration in terms of funding rounds going on when it comes to scale-ups in CEE region. Looked at this differently, looking at the total funding size, the chart looks pretty much the same. Roughly as much funding raised by scale-ups in the CEE region in the first quarter of this year, which again is not over yet, as in 2019. And 2020 was good for almost 1.5 billion euros raised. So keep in mind, this is the 84 scale-ups that we defined in our research. So this is not the total funding for startups as well. So this is another view looking at how extraordinary the first quarter of this year has already been. UiPath is, of course, an outlier with their $700 million round. Rolik was also an outlier in the Czech Republic, online grocery, online supermarket store, which has raised quite a substantial amount of funding as well. In Croatia, we have Rematch, we have Booksy in Poland, Skeleton Technologies in Estonia. So you can see that these scale-up funding rounds are also happening across the board when it comes to geography. We are looking at a different source now, so this is not necessarily our data. This is Invest Europe, previously called the European Venture Capital Association. So they release numbers every year for how much funding actually flows into certain regions. They gave a focus to CEE region. Unfortunately, they always stop a year behind with the data, so they only have data leading up to full year 2019. But even in their data, you can see pretty much the same phenomenon. Lots of funding, lots of growth, and especially on the later stage, the really big monster rounds that we kept on seeing in Europe in the last 5 years have now finally come to the CEE region as well. And I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming months. So looked at it differently, back to our data, is the VC funding in Central and Eastern Europe by stage. And there you can see that 2019 was really a breakout year. It was really a standout year when you compare it to 2018. 2020 was also quite extraordinary when you look at the total, which was almost 1.5 billion euros. But interestingly, when you look at the scale-up funding specifically, it was almost on par, almost the same as 2019, which I think is a very interesting observation. But again, we can already see by the numbers we've collected and monitored and vetted for the first quarter of 2021 that this is likely going to be a breakout year for the CEE region. I'll be very interested in revisiting this next year at the Wolf Summit to see how those numbers stack up for this year. So this is also another source. This is VestB. They've done an incredible amount of research on the CEE region, so I didn't want to downplay the significance of the help that we got from monitoring their research as well. These are some of the top 100 startups that they've identified. I'm sure you don't necessarily need to read all of those, but this is just to give you an idea that there's also a pipeline of super interesting, scalable, disruptive companies coming out of the CEE region that will very likely graduate, almost all of them, to scale-up stage, which means 15 million euro raised or more. So those should be very interesting to watch. And I will also make sure that you can download this presentation after the session. It's also quite notable that there are a large number of investors looking at the CEE region, trying to find the best companies to invest in. Of course, very local, city-based, national investors looking at local champions, but also regional investors, more and more cross-border investors, investments happening in neighboring countries in the CEE region. And interestingly, of course, we also see quite an uprise in international investors. So investors coming from the US, of course, but also the rest of Europe, Southeast Asia even, looking at the CEE region for interesting companies to invest in. So that will also be an interesting trend to observe in the coming months. When you look at the sectors that are raising scale-up funding in CEE, this is not, by the way, supposed to be a representation in terms of size. So this is just an overview of the typical industries that we noticed have been raising the most amount of funding. So from those 10, that is actually quite visible in the chart, in the visual, sorry, is that the fintech is really the leading category. This is, of course, also the case for the rest of Europe. So it's not that much of a surprise that fintech is also quite a substantial sector when it comes to scale-up funding in CEE region. But interestingly, if you look at Europe, the number 2 are enterprise software, so SaaS companies, and healthcare companies. In the CEE region, that is not the case, or at least not yet. And actually, the number 2 when it comes to industries raising scale-up funding are blockchain companies and e-commerce marketplaces companies, which is not similar to the rest of Europe. So that's quite a notable trend that we observed only for the CEE region. Healthcare is even just barely in the top 10, and you can see that the SaaS companies are also didn't make it even into the top 5. So we'll see if that changes over time, but it's quite noticeable that this is not the case in the rest of Europe. So the CEE is quite different in that regard. It's not just funding, it's also exits. We already mentioned the IPOs of Allegro and InPost. We've identified a number of other exits. Interestingly, 5 out of the 6 that you can find on this chart are IPOs, which is also quite a big difference with the rest of Europe. When scale-ups have a liquidity event or an exit in the rest of Europe, quite typically this is not an IPO. Actually, IPOs are quite rare, even though this is changing quite rapidly already this year. It's quite noticeable that in the CEE region in the last few years, IPOs have been quite a popular means of exit. You can also see that it wasn't just IPOs. Piperife was a big one, of course. They were already unicorn valuation when they got acquired but last year by Vista EP, which is a private equity firm. So that was an extremely interesting acquisition and quite a catalyst for innovation in Estonia in the years to come, I would argue. Now let's get to the bad news. When it comes to diversity data, looking at our data, this is where we score enormously poor. And we've actually been helped by research done by other organizations, but you can already see in this chart how bad the situation has gotten in the CEE region. I'll give you some numbers released yesterday, actually, by our friends at Experior Venture Fund and Unconventional Ventures. They've released a report on diversity in the CEE region, and the numbers are quite dismal. So this is quite a depressing statistic, especially compared to the rest of the charts that I've presented, which paint a very positive pictures. So in their research, we've noticed that over the last 5 years, 2.2% of the funding that went to CEE startups only went to all-female teams. If you include the amounts of mixed genders, so male founders combined with a female founder or multiple, that number goes up to 9% when you look at the last 5 years. However, it's very interesting to note and very depressing to note, I would argue, that the progress is actually nowhere. It's not even flat, it's going backwards. In 2020, those numbers were 1% of total investment went to female-only founding teams, and 5% went to mixed female-male founding teams. So those stats are really, really depressing. The same goes for venture funds in itself, because of course this is a result thereof. If you don't have diverse investors, you're never going to have diverse founding teams either. If you look at the funds that are active in the CEE region, only 85% of venture capital investment roles are held by men. If you look at the partner level, that number rises to 93%. So that means only 7% of women working in investment firms have actually reached a partner level rather than associate or VP. So that is a big problem because, as I said, this of course trickles down to where investment goes. Investors tend to sign bigger checks for men, and average round sizes at seed and Series A are also smaller for all women teams in Central Eastern Europe than they are for mixed and all men teams. And why is this a problem? That's because women-founded startups actually outperform male-founded companies for the most part. So they generate more revenue per euro invested, and women-led businesses also, judged by the research from Experian and conventional ventures at least, outperform in capital productivity by 96%. So I would know where I would be investing my money if I was a VC in the CEE region. That is all I have for you today. These are my contact details, so you can always contact me for, to get the presentation, or to if you want to comment or ask questions, feel free to contact me. This is not actually my last slide, because I wanted to point out that in less than an hour, TechEU is very, very proud to curate and host the Scaleup stage at the Wolf Summit. So we're going to be talking to a lot of interesting people from the CE region, a lot of names that you will actually recognize from the presentation. We have the CEO of Prezi, the CMO of Preply in Ukraine. We've got Damir Sabol from Photomath, media representatives, investors from all over Europe, from Speed Invest and Launch Hub Ventures in Bulgaria. So a very, very diverse mix of people that we've gathered for you. And I hope you can join us from noon to 4 p.m. CET. That's all I have for you today. Thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you in person at some point. Thank you.